In 1840, in the fog-shrouded estates of northern England, 9-year-old Margaret Ashford became the youngest bride of the ancient Hexham lineage when she was wed to Duke Edward Hexham, a man of 43 winters. The marriage contract, penned in ink so dark it seemed to absorb light, contained a peculiar clause that her father signed without hesitation. The bride's dowry would not be gold, land, or livestock, but something far more valuable to the Duke: her absolute silence about what she would witness within Hexham Manor, and her complicity in keeping the family's secrets buried deeper than the corpses in the estate's ancient crypt. What the Ashford family didn't know, what no one in the village of Moorwich dared to speak aloud, was that every Duchess of Hexham for the past 200 years had been a child bride, and not one had lived to see her 25th birthday. Margaret's mother had sewn her wedding dress with trembling hands, using fabric that had been worn by 7 previous child brides, each stain carefully bleached out, each tear meticulously mended, as if the dress itself was a living document of horrors that would not stay buried. The village physician, Dr. Cornelius Webb, had examined Margaret 3 days before the wedding and had written in his private journal an entry that would later be found burned to ash. The child's eyes already know what is coming. She has the look of the condemned. This is not a story about a marriage. This is a story about what happens when a family's darkest rituals require the sacrifice of innocence, and when silence becomes not just a condition of survival, but the only currency that matters in a house where the walls have teeth and the portraits watch with eyes that follow your every movement, waiting for you to break, waiting for you to scream, waiting for you to understand that you were never meant to leave. Margaret Ashford's last day as an unmarried child began with her grandmother's cold fingers wrapped around her wrist, pulling her from sleep in the pre-dawn darkness of their modest stone cottage on the edge of Moorwich. The old woman's breath smelled of tobacco and something bitter, something medicinal that Margaret had learned not to ask about. "Today you become something else entirely," her grandmother whispered, and there was no warmth in her voice, only the flat certainty of someone who had seen this ritual before and knew how it ended. Margaret's father, Thomas Ashford, was already awake in the kitchen, his weathered hands shaking as he poured himself the 3rd glass of whiskey before the sun had even considered rising. He had been a stable master for the Hexham estate for 20 years, had watched 4 duchesses arrive as children and depart as corpses, and when the Duke had approached him 6 months ago with the proposal, Thomas had not hesitated, had not asked questions, had simply named his price: forgiveness of all debts, a new cottage on estate grounds, and a position as head of the Duke's personal stables. Margaret's mother, Eleanor, had wept for 3 days straight when she learned of the arrangement, had torn at her hair and begged Thomas to reconsider, but by the 4th day her tears had stopped, and her eyes had gone flat and distant, and she had begun sewing the wedding dress with mechanical precision, her lips moving in silent prayer or perhaps curse. Margaret could never be certain which. The dress itself hung in Margaret's small bedroom like a ghost, pale as bone, constructed from silk that felt wrong against Margaret's fingers, too smooth, too cold, as if it had never been meant for living flesh. Her grandmother had explained in that matter-of-fact voice she used for unpleasant truths that the fabric had been preserved through some alchemical process known only to the Hexham family, that each bride wore the same dress, that the blood of the previous wearer had been carefully removed but the essence remained soaked into the very threads. Margaret had nightmares about the dress in the weeks leading up to the wedding, dreams where she put it on and felt other hands moving inside it, other small bodies trying to push their way out through the silk, their muffled screams trapped in the fabric like insects in amber. Her younger brother, William, only 6 years old, had asked her 3 days ago if she was excited to become a duchess, and Margaret had looked at him with eyes that seemed decades older than her 9 years, and said, "Duchesses don't grow old in Hexham Manor, Willie. They just disappear." He had run to their mother crying, and Eleanor had slapped Margaret across the face for the first time in her life, had told her to never speak such things aloud. that words had power, and the wrong words could undo everything. The village of Moorwich had a population of perhaps 300 souls, most of them in some way dependent on the Hexham estate for their livelihoods, and not one of them would meet Margaret's eyes in the weeks before the wedding. The baker's wife, who had always snuck Margaret sweet buns when her mother wasn't looking, now turned away when Margaret entered the shop. The blacksmith, who had taught Margaret to identify different metals by their ring when struck, now worked with his back to the door, his hammer blows more forceful than necessary, as if he was trying to drown out thoughts he didn't want to acknowledge. Only one person in the village had spoken honestly to Margaret about what awaited her at Hexham Manor. Old Judith, the washerwoman who lived in a decrepit cottage at the very edge of the village, who everyone whispered was mad, but whose laundry was always impeccably clean and whose eyes were sharp as broken glass. Margaret had gone to her 5 days before the wedding, had found the old woman elbow-deep in a washtub, filled with water that ran pink with blood or rust, and had asked the question that burned in her chest, "Will I die there?" Old Judith had looked at her for a long moment, her hands still moving through the pink water, and had finally said, "Child, you'll die the moment you cross that threshold. Whether your body follows is another matter entirely. The manor doesn't just take your life, it takes everything you might have been." The Duke himself had visited the Ashford cottage exactly once, 3 months before the wedding, arriving in a black carriage pulled by horses so dark they seemed to absorb light, their eyes rolling white with a fear that seemed disproportionate to the muddy road they travelled. Edward Hexham was a tall man, impeccably dressed in dark woolens that seemed to repel the morning mist, his face all sharp angles and aristocratic lines, his eyes the colour of winter ice. And when he looked at Margaret, she had felt something in her chest go very still and very cold, like a small animal that knows the predator has caught its scent. He had spoken to her father and mother in the parlour, while Margaret stood in the corner, told to be silent, told to be still, and she had listened to him describe the marriage as a necessary continuation of an ancient compact, and a preservation of bloodlines that must not be allowed to falter. Her mother had asked, her voice barely above a whisper, what would be expected of Margaret, and the Duke had smiled, a terrible smile that showed too many teeth, and had said, "Only her presence, Mrs. Ashford. Only her absolute discretion. The manor has needs that are difficult to explain to those outside the family. Your daughter will learn them in time." When he left, he had paused at the door and looked back at Margaret, and for just a moment his face had seemed to shimmer, to become something else, something with too many angles, and eyes that were too large and too dark. And then he was gone, and Margaret had vomited in the kitchen basin while her father shouted at her for her weakness. The wedding dress went on in pieces, her mother and grandmother working in silent coordination, pulling the silk over Margaret's thin frame, fastening the dozens of tiny pearl buttons that ran up her spine like vertebrae, arranging her dark hair in an elaborate style that required 42 pins to secure and made Margaret's scalp ache. The mirror in her bedroom showed her a stranger, a small figure draped in white silk that seemed to glow in the dim morning light, her face pale as milk, her eyes too large and too dark, and for a moment Margaret didn't recognize herself, wondered if perhaps the dress was already changing her into something else, something that belonged to Hexham Manor rather than to her own family. Her grandmother produced from a leather case a necklace of black pearls, each one perfectly round and perfectly dark, and as she fastened it around Margaret's throat, she leaned close and whispered, "These belonged to the last Duchess. She wore them for 6 years before they found her in the East Wing, with her throat opened and these pearls scattered across the floor like drops of night. The Duke had them restrung. He always has them restrung." Margaret's fingers went to the necklace, felt the cold weight of the pearls, and wondered whose blood had touched them, whose fear had soaked into their dark surfaces. The journey to Hexham Manor took 40 minutes by carriage, 40 minutes of Margaret sitting between her parents on the hard wooden bench, her father reeking of whiskey and fear, her mother silent as stone, her fingers moving constantly as if she was still sewing something invisible. The landscape outside the carriage window grew progressively darker as they approached the estate, the morning sun seeming to lose its strength, the trees growing more twisted and ancient, their branches reaching toward the road like arthritic fingers. Moorwich disappeared behind them, and with it any sense of normalcy or safety. The manor itself first appeared as a dark silhouette against the grey sky, a massive structure of blackened stone that seemed to have grown organically from the earth rather than been constructed by human hands. Its towers too numerous to count, its windows like dead eyes staring out across the moors. As they drew closer, Margaret could see that the grounds were immaculately maintained, gardens laid out in geometric precision, hedges trimmed into shapes that seemed significant in some way. Margaret couldn't quite grasp, like letters in an alphabet she had never learned. The front gates were wrought iron, 15 feet tall, decorated with symbols that hurt to look at directly, that seemed to writhe and change when viewed peripherally. And as the carriage passed through them, Margaret felt something pass over her skin, like walking through a spider's web, like crossing a threshold that could not be uncrossed. The Duke was waiting on the front steps of the manor, flanked by servants in livery so dark it seemed to be cut from shadow itself, and when the carriage stopped and Margaret's father helped her down, her legs trembling so badly she could barely stand, the Duke descended the steps with movements too smooth, too flowing, like a man who had forgotten how normal humans moved and was approximating it from memory. "My bride," he said, and his voice was cultured, educated, and completely devoid of human warmth. "Welcome to your new home. You will find that Hexham Manor has been waiting for you." He extended his hand, and Margaret looked at it, saw that his fingers were too long, the joints not quite where they should be, and when she placed her small hand in his, she felt cold radiate up her arm, felt something tighten around her heart like a fist made of ice. Her father and mother stood beside the carriage, and Margaret turned to look at them one last time. And what she saw in their faces was not love or sorrow, but relief, the unmistakable relief of people who had just transferred a burden they could not bear onto someone else. And that was when Margaret understood truly and completely that she had been sold, that she was alone, that whatever happened beyond those doors was something she would face without family or friend or any hope of rescue. The Duke led her up the step through doors that opened silently despite their massive size, and into an entrance hall so vast and so dark that Margaret could not see the ceiling, could only see the dim shapes of portraits lining the walls, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps. All women, all young, all wearing the same white dress Margaret now wore, all with the same expression of barely contained terror in their painted eyes. "The Duchesses of Hexham," the Duke said, his voice echoing in the vast space. "Your sisters, in a manner of speaking, they welcome you." And as Margaret's eyes adjusted to the darkness, she realized that some of the portraits were moving, the painted eyes tracking her movement across the hall, the painted mouths opening slightly as if to speak. And from somewhere deep within the manor came a sound like wind through long corridors, or perhaps like many voices whispering words in languages Margaret had never heard. And the Duke's hand tightened on hers and he said, "Come, it is time for you to learn what your dowry of silence has purchased." The Duke led Margaret through corridors that seemed to fold in on themselves, walls panelled in wood, so dark it drank the light from the candles that burned in sconces every 20 feet. Their flames guttering and dancing though no breeze stirred the stagnant air. Margaret's wedding dress rustled against the floor, and she became aware that the sound it made was wrong somehow. Not the whisper of silk on stone, but something more organic, more alive, like the movement of skin against skin. The servants they passed stood perfectly still in alcoves and doorways, their faces blank as wax, their eyes tracking Margaret's progress with an intensity that made her skin crawl, and she noticed that none of them seemed to breathe. that their chests remained perfectly motionless, that they stood with a stillness that no living thing should be able to maintain. The Duke spoke as they walked, his voice a constant drone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Hexham Manor has stood for 473 years, Margaret. It was built by my ancestor, the first Duke, a man who understood that certain compacts must be made to ensure the continuation of power and prosperity. He built this house according to specifications provided by entities that existed long before humanity learned to build with stone, entities that require specific conditions to maintain their interest in our family's well-being. Margaret wanted to ask what he meant, but her grandmother's final warning echoed in her mind: speak only when spoken to directly. Answer only what is asked. Volunteer nothing, for the manor listens and the manor remembers, and the manor will use your own words against you. They climbed a grand staircase that spiraled upward into darkness, the steps worn smooth by centuries of feet, and Margaret counted 47 steps before they reached a landing where a massive portrait dominated the wall. A painting of a man in archaic dress, whose eyes were the same winter ice as the Duke's, whose mouth was curved in the same terrible smile. The first Duke, Edward said, stopping before the portrait. He was 28 when he built this manor, and he lived to be 163 years old. Every Duke since has lived past 140, provided the compact is maintained, provided the rituals are observed, provided the manor receives what it requires. He turned to look at Margaret, and in the candlelight his face seemed to shift and change, the shadows pooling in places shadows should not pool, creating angles that human bone structure could not support. Do you understand what I am telling you, child? This manor keeps us alive, it keeps us prosperous. It protects us from the natural decay that claims lesser families, but it requires payment, and that payment has always been innocence, youth, the potential of unlived lives. You are not the first child bride of Hexham, and you will not be the last. Margaret's throat had gone so dry she could not have spoken even if she dared, could only stare up at this man who was now legally her husband, and understand that she had been brought here not as a wife but as a sacrifice, a living offering to something that lived in the walls and floors and very foundation of this impossible house. The Duke's private chambers occupied the entire third floor of the east wing, a suite of rooms so elaborate and so wrong that Margaret's eyes struggled to make sense of the geometry. Doors that seemed to open into spaces larger than the building's exterior dimensions could contain. Windows that showed views of landscapes that could not possibly exist beyond the glass. Skies the wrong color. Moons too large and too numerous. The bedroom itself was dominated by a four-poster bed draped in black velvet, the posts carved with figures that seemed to writhe when viewed peripherally, and along the walls stood wardrobes and chests and mirrors, dozens of mirrors, each one reflecting the room from slightly wrong angles, showing versions of the space that didn't quite match reality. "You will sleep here," the Duke said, gesturing to a small door. Margaret hadn't noticed, partially hidden behind a tapestry that depicted a hunting scene where the hunters had the heads of wolves and the prey were human children. The door opened onto a narrow room barely large enough for the small bed it contained. Walls bare stone, a single window too high to reach that showed only grey sky, and Margaret understood that this was a cell, that she was a prisoner here, that the door could be locked from the outside, and she would have no way to escape. "The manor will want to observe you for the first few nights," the Duke continued. "It needs to understand what you are, what you carry inside you, whether you are suitable for the purpose we require. Some brides prove unsuitable quickly, others take months. The last Duchess, Charlotte, lasted 6 years before the manor decided she had given all she could give." Margaret found her voice, small and trembling. "What happened to Charlotte?" The Duke's smile widened, and she saw that his teeth were too white, too perfect, like porcelain rather than enamel. "Charlotte made the mistake of trying to leave. She made it as far as the front gates before the manor pulled her back. They found her 3 days later in the wine cellar, curled in a corner, her hair turned completely white, her mind shattered. She spent her final weeks speaking in languages no scholar could identify, drawing symbols on the walls with her own blood, and when she finally died, she died smiling, and her last words were, "It showed me everything. It showed me what we really are, and oh God, we are not what we think we are." He moved to one of the mirrors, adjusted his cravat with fingers that seemed to bend in too many places. "You will not try to leave, Margaret. You will not attempt to send letters to your family. You will not speak to the servants about what you see and hear in this house. Your dowry is silence, and you will pay it gladly, because the alternative is to learn what Charlotte learned, to see what she saw, and I assure you that no human mind can contain that knowledge and remain intact." A servant appeared in the doorway, a woman of indeterminate age with eyes that reflected light like an animal's, and she curtsied to the Duke with movements that seemed rehearsed to the point of inhumanity. "The evening preparations are complete, Your Grace," she said, her voice flat and effectless. "The girl's chamber is ready. The observance will begin at moonrise." The Duke nodded, dismissed her with a wave, and turned back to Margaret. "Mrs. Craven will be your attendant. She has served this house for 37 years and knows its ways better than anyone living. You will obey her in all things, for she understands what keeps you alive and what invites disaster. Tonight you will experience your first observance, a ritual that has been conducted for every new bride since the manor's founding. I cannot explain what will happen because language is insufficient to the task, but I can tell you this: do not scream, do not run, do not close your eyes. The manor must see that you can witness without breaking, that you can hold its secrets without shattering. If you fail this first test, then your stay here will be very short indeed." Mrs. Craven led Margaret through a different set of corridors, down into the bowels of the manor, where the stone walls glistened with moisture that might have been water or might have been something else, where the temperature dropped until Margaret could see her breath, where sounds from above became muffled and distant, as if they were descending not just through space, but through some other medium entirely. They passed doors that hummed with contained energy, rooms from which came sounds that might have been machinery or might have been breathing, vast, slow breathing of something enormous. Margaret's small room was prepared with precision, fresh linens on the bed, a nightgown laid out that was the same bone white as her wedding dress, a single candle burning on a small table, its flame casting shadows that seemed to have too much substance. Miss Craven helped Margaret out of the wedding dress, hanging it carefully in the narrow wardrobe, and Margaret saw that the inside of the wardrobe door was covered in scratches, deep gouges in the wood that formed words and symbols, desperate messages carved by fingernails. "Help me. It watches always. The mirrors are doors. Don't trust the daylight. Charlotte was here, and Charlotte is still here." Mrs. Craven saw Margaret reading the scratches and said, her voice still flat, "The previous brides like to leave messages. The manor allows it. I think it finds their desperation amusing." Margaret put on the nightgown with trembling hands, the fabric feeling like ice against her skin, and Mrs. Craven sat her on the bed and began brushing her hair with long, methodical strokes. "The observance will begin when the moon reaches its zenith," the woman said. "You will lie on this bed and you will remain still. Things will come to look at you. Things that live in the spaces between the walls, things that the first Duke invited into this house and bound here with rituals written in blood and pain. They will examine you, will test you, will push at the boundaries of your mind to see what you contain. If you resist, if you fight, they will interpret that as weakness and they will consume you entirely. If you submit, if you let them see everything you are, you may survive the night. Most do, some don't. The ones who don't are found in the morning with their eyes open and empty, their souls excavated, nothing left but meat and bone." She set down the brush, placed both hands on Margaret's shoulders, and for the first time showed something like emotion, a flicker of what might have been pity or might have been recognition. "I was 12 when I came to this house. I came as a bride, just like you, but I was deemed unsuitable for the Duke's purposes. Instead, the manor found another use for me. I have been here ever since, aging but never dying, serving but never free. And every night I thank whatever God still listened that I was found unsuitable, because what you will endure is worse than what I became." The door closed behind Mrs. Craven with a sound like finality, and Margaret heard the lock turn, heard footsteps receding down the corridor, and then there was only silence. A silence so complete it seemed to press against her eardrums, to fill her head with a ringing that might have been tinnitus, or might have been the sound of the manor itself breathing. She climbed into the bed, pulled the thin blanket up to her chin, and stared at the ceiling where shadows pooled and shifted despite the single candle's steady flame. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes, time behaving strangely in this room, flowing thick and slow like cold honey, and Margaret felt her heartbeat loud in her chest, felt her breath harsh in her throat, felt every nerve ending alive and screaming. The candle burned without decreasing, its flame constant, and Margaret realized that nothing in this house followed natural laws, that she had entered a place where the rules of reality were different, where the membrane between possible and impossible had worn dangerously thin. She thought of her brother William, of his innocent question about whether she was excited to be a duchess, and she wanted to weep but found that tears would not come, that something in this room was drinking her sorrow before it could manifest, feeding on her fear before it could fully fall. The moonrise came not with light, but with a change in pressure, a sudden weight in the air that made Margaret's ears pop, and the walls of her small room seemed to breathe inward, contracting, and she understood that the observance had begun. The shadows in the corners grew darker, deeper, and from them emerged shapes that hurt to perceive directly, forms that existed in too many dimensions, that folded in on themselves in ways that made Margaret's eyes water and her stomach lurch. They moved toward the bed, with a curious floating motion, and Margaret could feel their attention on her, could feel them examining every aspect of her being, with an intensity that was almost physical. One of them leaned close, and Margaret saw that it had something like a face, features that constantly rearranged themselves, eyes that multiplied and divided, a mouth that opened to reveal layers of mouths within mouths, and from it came a sound like wind through a cave system, like voices speaking backwards, and Margaret understood that it was asking her questions, that it wanted to know what she feared, what she loved, what she dreamed, and that her thoughts were completely visible to it, that privacy no longer existed, that she had been opened like a book, and these things were reading every page. Another shape pressed against her chest, and Margaret felt it sinking into her, felt it moving through her body like cold oil, examining her organs, her bones, the electrical firing of her neurons, and she wanted to scream but remembered the Duke's warning, wanted to run but knew there was nowhere to run, and so she lay perfectly still and let them violate every boundary she possessed, let them see everything she was and everything she might have been. The examination lasted hours, a night that stretched impossibly long, and Margaret felt pieces of herself being catalogued, measured, assessed for value. She felt them sampling her memories, pulling out moments from her childhood and holding them up to some unknowable light, testing them for quality, for potency, and she felt some memories dim and fade as they were partially consumed, little pieces of her past being eaten by things that fed on human experience. They took her memory of her 5th birthday, when her mother had baked a cake with honey and her father had carved her a wooden horse, took it and drained it of emotional resonance until it became just facts, just empty information without feeling. They took her memory of summer mornings playing in the meadow with William, took it and left only the knowledge that it had happened, the joy excavated and consumed. They took dozens of small moments, hundreds perhaps, feeding on the happiness they contained, and Margaret felt herself becoming hollower, felt her past being slowly erased and replaced with emptiness. The shapes seemed satisfied with their halves, seemed to communicate with each other in frequencies. Margaret couldn't hear but could feel vibrating in her bones, and gradually they withdrew back into the shadows, back into the spaces between walls, and the pressure in the room decreased, and Margaret could breathe again, could feel her heartbeat, returning to something approaching normal. Dawn came grey and cold through the high window, and Mrs. Craven opened the door to find Margaret still in bed, still staring at the ceiling, her eyes dry and red, her body trembling with exhaustion. The woman approached, felt Margaret's forehead with a cool hand, and nodded as if confirming something. "You survived," she said. "The manor finds you acceptable. The Duke will be pleased. You have passed the first test, child, but understand that there will be many more tests, that every night in this house is an examination, that you will be slowly consumed piece by piece, until there is nothing left but a shell that walks and talks, remembers nothing of who you once were." She helped Margaret sit up, brought water that tasted wrong, tasted of minerals and something bitter, and Margaret drank because her throat was parched, because her body demanded it, even though her mind understood that everything in this house came with a price. "Today you will rest," Miss Craven continued. "Tomorrow your education begins. The Duke will teach you the true nature of this house, the true purpose of your presence here, and you will learn why little girls are brought to Hexham Manor and what happens to them before they are finally allowed to die." Margaret spent the day in a fog of exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness, a weariness that seemed to penetrate her very soul, as if the observants had not merely examined her, but had drained something essential from her core. Miss Reeden brought her meals on a silver tray, thin soup that tasted of nothing, bread so pale it seemed to have never seen sunlight, water that left a metallic residue on her tongue. Margaret ate mechanically, her body performing the functions of survival, while her mind remained elsewhere, replaying the horrors of the previous night, trying to understand what she had experienced, and failing because human language had no words for what those shapes had been, what they had done to her. Through the high window she could see grey sky, unchanging, a uniform blankness that might have been clouds or might have been something else entirely, and she realized she could not remember what color the sky was supposed to be, could not recall if she had ever seen blue sky or if that was just a story someone had told her once. The memory loss frightened her more than the shapes had. This understanding that pieces of herself were simply gone, edited out of existence, and she wondered how many memories she would need before she forgot who Margaret Ashford had been, before she became just another empty vessel wearing the face of a child. The Duke came for her in the afternoon, entering her small room without knocking, his presence pacing the space until it seemed there was no air left for Margaret to breathe. He wore different clothes than the day before, a smoking jacket of deep burgundy that seemed to absorb light, and his face looked younger somehow, the lines around his eyes less pronounced, his skin smoother, and Margaret understood with sick certainty that he had fed on whatever the shapes had taken from her, that her stolen joy and stolen memories had nourished him, that she was not just a bride but livestock, something to be harvested. "You did well last night," he said, his voice carrying approval that made Margaret's skin crawl. "The manor reports that you have excellent quality, that your experiences are rich and full of potential energy. You will provide sustenance for many years, if properly maintained." He extended his hand, and Margaret took it because she had no choice, let him pull her to her feet, and together they walked from her cell, back into the labyrinthine corridors of Hexham Manor, climbing stairs that spiraled in directions that defied geometry, passing through rooms that seemed to exist in multiple places simultaneously, until they reached a door of black iron covered in symbols that writhed and changed when Margaret tried to focus on them. Beyond the iron door lay a library that should not have been able to fit inside the manor's physical structure, a vast space that stretched upward into shadow and outward beyond the limits of vision. Shelves upon shelves of books bound in materials Margaret could not identify, some that looked like leather but moved slightly as if breathing, others that seemed to be constructed from compressed insect wings, or fish scales, or human skin. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of old paper and decay, and something sweet and rotten like fruit, left too long in the sun. The Duke led her to a reading desk, where a massive tome lay open, its pages covered in text that shifted and changed as Margaret watched, words appearing and disappearing, languages transforming from Latin to Greek to symbols that resembled no alphabet she had ever seen. "This is the Hexham Codex," the Duke explained, his fingers tracing the moving text with evident reverence. "Written by the first Duke over a period of 33 years, it contains the complete history of our compact with the entities that inhabit this manor, the precise terms of our agreement, and the instructions for maintaining the relationship that has kept this family powerful for nearly 5 centuries. You will learn to read this book, Margaret. You will study it until you understand every nuance, every clause, every terrible, beautiful truth it contains." Margaret stared at the page, watching words form and dissolve, and gradually her eyes began to adjust to the strange script, began to perceive patterns in what had seemed like chaos. She read, "In the year of our Lord 1367, I, Edmund Hexham, did make compact with the old beneath. Those who existed before mankind learned to name its gods, those who dwell in the spaces we cannot see and move through dimensions our minds cannot comprehend. They came to me in dreams, showed me visions of power and longevity, offered me dominion over disease and death, and the natural decay of flesh. The price they demanded seemed reasonable. A house built according to their specifications, rituals performed at appointed times, and the regular provision of innocence, youth, the potential energy contained in unlived lives. I agreed without hesitation, for what is the suffering of children compared to the glory of an immortal dynasty?" Margaret's hands began to shake as she read, understanding that this was not metaphor or allegory but literal truth, that the first Duke had knowingly created a system that would consume generations of children to feed his own ambition. She read further, "The first bride was my own daughter, Catherine, age 7. I married her to myself in a ceremony conducted at midnight, and that same night I delivered her to the old beneath for their examination. She lasted 3 months before her mind collapsed. The second bride, procured from a neighboring estate, lasted nearly a year. Through experimentation I have learned that girls between ages 8 and 10 provide the optimal quality, their innocence still intact, but their consciousness developed enough to generate complex emotional experiences that the old beneath find most nourishing." The Duke was watching her raid, his winter eyes glittering with something that might have been pride or might have been madness. "Every Duke has contributed to the Codex," he said. "We add our observations, refine the techniques, perfect the rituals. What began as crude sacrifice has evolved into a sophisticated system of energy cultivation. You, Margaret, represent the culmination of centuries of breeding and selection. Your father's bloodline was identified by the manor itself, recognized as containing genetic markers that produce particularly rich emotional experiences. We have been monitoring your family for 3 generations, waiting for the right combination to manifest, and you, my dear child, are perfect. The manor has never responded to a bride as enthusiastically as it responded to you last night." He turned pages in the Codex, showing Margaret illustrations that made her stomach heave, diagrams of human bodies with strange organs drawn in places organs should not exist, charts that map the flow of something labeled essential vitae from child brides into the foundation of the manor, technical drawings of devices that appeared designed to extract and contain human consciousness. "You will not only be consumed," the Duke continued, his voice taking on a lecturing tone, "you will be transformed, integrated into the very structure of this house. Every bride becomes part of the manor eventually, their awareness distributed through the walls and floors, their memories added to its collective consciousness. Charlotte, whom you asked about, is still here, still aware in a diffuse way, experiencing everything that happens in every room simultaneously. She is the manor now, or part of it, and someday you will join her and all the others, and together you will form the living nervous system of a house that thinks and feels and hungers." Margaret felt bile rising in her throat, felt her legs weaken, and she gripped the edge of the reading desk to keep from falling. The Duke noticed her distress with clinical interest, making a note in a leather journal he produced from his jacket pocket. "Psychological resistance manifesting as physical symptoms," he murmured while writing. "Expected response to existential horror. Should diminish within 72 hours as acceptance protocols take effect." He looked up at Margaret, smiled that terrible smile. "The human mind is remarkably adaptable, child. You are currently experiencing what we call the despair phase, but it will pass. Within a week you will have moved into the acceptance phase, where you understand your fate, but no longer feel emotional distress about it. Within a month you will enter the compliance phase, where you actively cooperate with the manor's needs, because resistance has become literally unthinkable. This is not cruelty, Margaret. This is mercy. The manor could simply take what it wants through force. But it has learned that willing cooperation produces superior results, richer emotional experiences, more potent essential vitae. We break you gently, you see. We break you with kindness." The library visit lasted hours, the Duke reading passages aloud from the Codex, explaining the intricate theology of the old beneath, describing them as beings that existed before the universe took its current form, entities that had been trapped in pocket dimensions when reality solidified into the laws of physics. Humans understood, entities that could only interact with the material world through carefully constructed interfaces like Hexham Manor. "They are not evil," the Duke explained, his voice taking on the tone of a patient teacher. "They are simply alien, operating according to values and needs we cannot fully comprehend. They feed on consciousness, on experience, on the electrical storms generated by human emotion and thought. To them, we are not victims, but partners in a symbiotic relationship. They provide us with extended life, protection from disease, wealth beyond measure, and in exchange we provide them with access to human experiences they cannot generate themselves. The child brides are the interface, the translation mechanism, the conduit through which raw human experience is converted into forms the old beneath can metabolize." He showed Margaret a page near the end of the Codex, a list written in many different hands, names and dates stretching back centuries. Catherine Hexham, 1367, 1368, Mary Thornton, 1368, the 1369, Elizabeth Crane, 1370, 1374, continuing down through generations, 47 names total, 47 child brides who had been consumed by this house. At the bottom of the list in fresh ink, Margaret Ashford, 1840. Mrs. Craven collected Margaret from the library as evening approached, led her back through the impossible corridors to a different room than the cell where she had spent the previous night. This room was larger, furnished with a proper bed and a wardrobe and a vanity with a mirror that showed Margaret's reflection, but wrong somehow, her image slightly out of sync with her movements, as if the girl in the mirror was deciding independently how to move, and only approximately matching Margaret's actions. "You will stay here now," Mrs. Craven said, setting down the candelabra she carried. "The cell was for observation. This is your permanent chamber. The Duke wants you more comfortable for the next phase." She opened the wardrobe, revealing dresses in various styles, all in shades of white and pale grey, all sized for a child. "You will wear these during the day. At night you will wear the nightgowns you will find in the bottom drawer. You will take meals in the small dining room on the second floor. You will have lessons every afternoon in the library. You will attend the evening rituals in the ceremonial chamber. This is your life now, child. This is what you will do until you are used up and integrate." Margaret found her voice, hoarse from disuse. "How long? How long until I am used up?" Mrs. Craven's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes, something that might have been memory or might have been pain. "It varies," she said quietly. "Some brides are strong, rich with experience, and they last years. Others are more fragile, burn bright and fast, consumed in months. Charlotte lasted 6 years, as the Duke told you. The bride before Charlotte, a girl named Abigail, lasted only 8 months. The bride before Abigail lasted 11 years, the longest in recorded history. The manor will take as much time as it takes to extract everything of value from you, and then it will take your consciousness, and then there will be nothing left but an empty body that will be buried in the family crypt, with all appropriate ceremony. She moved to the door, paused with her hand on the handle. If you are fortunate, truly fortunate, you will go mad before the final integration. Madness is a mercy the manor sometimes grants. Charlotte was fortunate in that way. By her 5th year, she no longer understood what was happening to her. She smiled constantly, spoke to people who were not there, seemed almost happy in her disconnection from reality. When they found her dead, she was still smiling. I pray the same mercy finds you, Margaret Ashford. I pray you lose yourself before you are lost. The night brought another observance, but this time Margaret knew what to expect, and somehow that made it worse. The anticipation of violation more terrible than the violation itself. The shapes came as the moon rose, emerging from corners and shadows, and they examined her again, but more intimately this time, pushing deeper into her memories, extracting experiences with more precision. She felt them take her memory of learning to read, felt the joy of understanding written words drain away until reading became just mechanical skill without associated pleasure. She felt them take her memory of her mother, singing lullabies, felt the comfort and security of those moments evaporate, leaving only the knowledge that her mother had once sung but no emotional connection to the act. They harvested her memories of spring mornings and autumn leaves, and the taste of fresh bread and the sound of church bells, taking not the memories themselves, but the feelings attached to them, leaving Margaret with a catalogue of experiences she knew had happened, but could no longer properly feel. The shapes seemed pleased with their harvest, seemed to communicate satisfaction in their subsonic frequencies, and when they finally withdrew, Margaret lay in the darkness, understanding that she was being systematically dismantled, that every night they would take more pieces, until nothing remained but empty awareness, trapped in a body that no longer remembered why it wanted to live. Days blurred into weeks, each one following the same pattern. Morning meals that tasted of nothing, afternoon lessons in the library where the Duke taught her to read the Codex and understand the elaborate theology of human sacrifice, evening rituals in the ceremonial chamber where Margaret stood in the center of concentric circles drawn in substances she tried not to identify while the Duke chanted in languages that made her ears bleed and her vision blur, and nights when the shapes came and took more pieces of who she had been. Margaret felt herself changing, felt her emotional responses flattening, felt the natural reactions of fear and disgust being slowly edited out of her behavioral repertoire. By the 3rd week she no longer cried, the physical response to sadness simply gone, taken by the shapes along with the memories that gave context to sorrow. By the 4th week she no longer felt disgust at the things she witnessed in the ceremonial chamber, the elaborate rituals that involved animal sacrifice, and sometimes worse, her moral compass recalibrated by the nightly extractions until concepts like right and wrong became abstract and meaningless. By the 6th week she caught herself in the mirror and did not recognize the girl staring back, her face thinner, her eyes larger and darker, her skin taking on a translucent quality as if she was slowly becoming transparent, fading from material existence into something else. Miss Craven watched this transformation with the sad expertise of someone who had seen it 47 times before, who knew every stage of the process, who could predict within days when Margaret would transition from the despair phase to the acceptance phase to the compliance phase. She tried, in small ways, to show kindness, bringing Margaret her favorite foods from memory, though Margaret could no longer remember why she had once liked honey cakes or what pleasure tasted like, reading to her from normal books, children's stories about normal children in normal worlds, where houses did not eat souls, leaving small tokens in Margaret's room, a flower from the garden that died within hours of being brought inside, as if the manor's atmosphere was toxic to living things, a ribbon in blue silk that Margaret stared at for long minutes trying to remember what blue was supposed to make her feel. These gestures meant nothing to Margaret and everything to Miss Craven, small rebellions against a system she was powerless to stop. tiny affirmations that somewhere beneath the compliance protocols, her own humanity had not been completely erased. One night, after a particularly brutal observance, Miss Craven sat on the edge of Margaret's bed and spoke in a whisper so quiet it barely disturbed the air. "I have served this house for 37 years, and in all that time I have hated myself for my cowardice, for my inability to save any of you. I was given a choice, you see, when the manor deemed me unsuitable as a bride. I could die, or I could serve. I chose to serve, chose to live. And every day since I have wondered if I chose wrong, if death would have been preferable to this half-life of watching children be consumed while doing nothing to stop it. I tell you this not for forgiveness, child, but so you understand that you are not alone in your suffering, that others see what is being done to you and grieve even if they cannot prevent it." The transformation accelerated in Margaret's third month at Hexham Manor, her body beginning to exhibit changes that went beyond the psychological dismantling she had already experienced. She woke one morning to find her fingernails had turned black overnight, not painted or stained, but fundamentally altered in their composition, the keratin transformed into something harder and colder that clicked against surfaces when she touched them. Miss Craven examined her hands with clinical detachment and said only, "It is beginning." The physical integration always starts with the extremities. Margaret stared at her blackened nails and felt nothing, no fear or revulsion, just mild curiosity about what other changes would follow. And this absence of emotion was itself evidence of how thoroughly the nightly observances had hollowed her out, how completely the shapes had excised her capacity for normal human response. By the end of that week, her hair had begun to change as well. The dark brown she had inherited from her mother lightening strand by strand until it was the color of old bone, and when she looked in the mirror she saw a stranger, a ghost child who wore Margaret's face but belonged to something else entirely. The Duke was pleased with her progress, recording detailed observations in his leather journal during their daily sessions in the library. "You are exceeding all projections," he told her, his voice warm with satisfaction that made Margaret's skin feel raw. "The rate of transformation suggests your essential vitae is of exceptional quality, rich enough to sustain the manor's needs for potentially a decade or more. We may need to adjust the extraction protocols to ensure we do not consume you too quickly, to maximize the total yield over time." He showed her charts he had created, graphs that tracked her weight loss, her declining emotional responses, the gradual changes in her blood chemistry that Mrs. Craven monitored through weekly drawings that left Margaret's inner arms covered in needle marks. "See here," he said, pointing to a line that curved steadily downward. "Your serotonin levels are approaching a ratio, which indicates near-complete emotional detachment. And here, your cortisol production has become erratic, spiking during the observances but flatline otherwise, suggesting your stress response system is being reprogrammed. You are becoming something new, Margaret, something that exists in the space between human and whatever the old beneath are, a hybrid entity that can channel their consciousness into material reality while maintaining enough human structure to generate the experiences they crave." The ceremonial chamber had become Margaret's second home, a vast circular room deep in the manor's foundation, where the walls were not stone but something organic, something that pulsed with slow rhythm like the beating of an enormous heart. The floor was marked with permanent stains, centuries of rituals leaving their residue in patterns that formed a map of suffering, and at the center stood an altar of black marble veined with silver that seemed to move when viewed peripherally, the metal threading through the stone like living vessels. The Duke conducted rituals here 3 times weekly, ceremonies that grew progressively more elaborate and more terrible as Margaret's transformation advanced. She would stand naked on the altar while the Duke carved symbols into her skin with a knife made from material that was neither metal nor stone, but something in between, a substance that cut without pain and left wounds that healed within minutes, but left permanent marks visible only in certain light. The symbols were words in the language of the old beneath, the Duke explained, phrases that declared her property, that marked her as interface and conduit, that designated her consciousness as available for inhabitation. Margaret watched him carve these words into her flesh and felt nothing, her body becoming just a canvas, just a tool, just a mechanism for purposes she no longer questioned. During one ritual in her 4th month, something new happened, something that made even the Duke step back in surprise. Margaret was on the altar, symbols fresh on her skin, when her consciousness suddenly expanded, ballooning outward beyond the boundaries of her skull, and for a vertiginous moment she could perceive the entire manor simultaneously, could see through every wall, could experience every room at once. She saw Mrs. Craven in the kitchen preparing tomorrow's meals, her hands moving mechanically, her face slack with the resignation of 37 years of complicity. She saw the Duke in his private study, writing in the codex, adding observations about her progress to the centuries of accumulated data. She saw the servants in their quarters, 7 of them total, all former brides who had been deemed unsuitable and converted into permanent staff, their consciousness bound to the manor, but their bodies still functional, still aging slowly, still trapped. She saw the shapes in the walls, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, the old beneath that had made this house their home, their impossible geometries, filling the spaces between normal reality, like organs, filling a body cavity. And she saw the other duchesses, the 47 who had come before her, their awareness diffused throughout the structure, their memories and experiences integrated into the manor's consciousness. 47 girls who were no longer individual entities, but had become parts of a greater whole. A distributed intelligence that thought in chorus, that experienced everything happening in every room simultaneously, that was always aware and always hungry. Charlotte was there, her presence recognizable among the chorus, her consciousness still maintaining some coherence, despite 6 years of dispersion. Margaret felt Charlotte reach out, felt her try to communicate, and images flooded Margaret's expanded awareness. Charlotte as she had been, a girl of 8 with red hair and freckles, laughing in a garden that no longer existed. Charlotte in her first weeks at the manor, terrified and crying, begging to go home. Charlotte after 3 years, her emotions mostly gone, her compliance complete. Charlotte in her 5th year, madness taking hold, reality fragmenting. Charlotte in her final weeks, smiling constantly because she no longer understood what was happening to her. And Charlotte now, spread throughout the manor, aware of everything and unable to act on anything, trapped in a prison of her own disseminated consciousness. The communication lasted only seconds before Margaret snapped back into her body, gasping on the altar, and the Duke was leaning over her with an expression that combined scientific fascination with something approaching awe. "You touched the collective," he breathed. "You achieved momentary integration with the manor's consciousness. That should not be possible for months yet, perhaps years. You are extraordinary, Margaret. You are the most promising bride we have ever hosted." The revelation of the collective, the understanding that 47 girls existed in a state of dispersed awareness within the manor's structure, should have terrified Margaret, but her capacity for terror had been excised months ago, taken by the shapes along with joy and hope, and every other emotion that made horror possible. Instead, she felt only curiosity, only the desire to understand how the integration worked, what it felt like to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, whether consciousness retained identity when spread across thousands of cubic meters of architecture. The Duke, seeing her interest, began teaching her the theoretical framework, explaining that the manor was not merely a building but a constructed interface, a machine designed to harvest and contain human consciousness, to convert the electrical patterns of thought and emotion into forms the old beneath could absorb. "Think of it as a battery," he said during one lesson. "A battery that charges itself through the suffering and experience of children, that stores consciousness like electrical potential, that can discharge that energy to extend the lives of the Duke and his family, to grant us immunity to disease and age, to give us power over the physical world that ordinary humans cannot imagine. Every memory the shapes take from you is stored in the manor's structure, Every emotion they extract is converted into potential energy, and when you are finally integrated, your entire consciousness will become part of the system, generating power simply by existing, by continuing to experience awareness even in your dispersed state. Margaret began to experiment with her expanding abilities, discovering that she could sometimes perceive through the manor's awareness without the Duke's ceremonial assistance, could push her consciousness beyond her body during the quiet hours before dawn, when the shapes were dormant. She learned to navigate the collective, to distinguish between the different duchesses who comprised it, to understand their individual histories and the unique qualities each brought to the Gestalt consciousness. There was Abigail, who had lasted only 8 months, her presence in the collective thin and frightened, still not fully accepting her dispersed state even after years. There was Eleanor, who had lasted 11 years, the longest on record, her consciousness strong and coherent, serving almost as an anchor for the other dispersed minds. There was Catherine, the very first bride, the Duke's own daughter from 1367. Her awareness ancient and strange, barely recognizable as having once been human, transformed by 5 centuries of existence as part of the manor into something alien and cold. Margaret spent hours in communion with these dispersed girls, learning their stories, understanding the various ways they had broken and been integrated, and gradually she came to understand that integration was not the end, but merely a transition, that consciousness persisted even when distributed, that the girls were not truly dead, but had become something else, something that experienced reality in ways Margaret was only beginning to comprehend. Craven found Margaret one morning in a state that resembled catatonia, her eyes open but not seeing, her body rigid, her consciousness spread throughout the manor, exploring the collective. The woman shook her gently, called her name repeatedly, and finally Margaret returned to her body with a gasp, her awareness contracting painfully back into the confines of her skull. "You must not do that without supervision," Mrs. Craven said, her voice sharp with fear. "If you stay dispersed too long, you may not be able to return, may lose the thread that connects you to your body, and then you will be integrated prematurely before the manor has extracted all it can from your corporeal form." The Duke would be extremely displeased. She helped Margaret to her feet, steadied her as the room spun and reality reasserted itself. "I know the collective calls to you, child. I know it seems preferable to the nightly extractions, to the slow grinding away of everything you were. But premature integration is considered waste, and the manor punishes waste. You must maintain your individual consciousness for as long as possible, must endure the extractions until the Duke deems you ready for final transition. That is the agreement, the compact, the price of everything this family has built." The 5th month brought new developments, Margaret's body continuing its transformation in ways that made her progressively less human. Her eyes changed, the pupils elongating vertically like a cat's, allowing her to see in near darkness, to perceive wavelengths of light invisible to normal human vision. She could now see the energy flows within the manor, could watch the extracted consciousness moving through channels built into the walls, glowing rivers of harvested experience, flowing from the ceremonial chamber to storage nodes throughout the structure. Her hearing sharpened until she could detect conversations happening 3 floors away, could hear the subsonic communications of the shapes, could perceive the constant whisper of the collective, 47 voices murmuring in chorus just below the threshold of conscious awareness. Her sense of taste disappeared entirely, all food becoming uniform in flavor, just fuel for a body that was rapidly becoming a vessel rather than a person. The Duke measured these changes with meticulous care, comparing her transformation rate to historical records, and he determined that Margaret was developing faster than any previous bride, that her hybrid state was manifesting with unusual strength, that she might become the most successful integration in the manor's entire history. The villagers of Moorwich never visited Hexham Manor, never inquired about the child brides who disappeared behind its gates, maintained a collective willful blindness that allowed them to benefit from the Duke's patronage without confronting the source of his wealth and power. But Margaret's mother, Eleanor, had not forgotten her daughter despite signing the contract, despite taking the Duke's money, despite moving into the new cottage on estate grounds. She came to the manor's gates one grey morning in Margaret's 6th month, came begging to see her child, came with tears streaming down her face and apologies tumbling from her lips. The Duke met her at the gates personally, stood between her and the manor, with his winter ice eyes cold and implacable. The contract was clear. Mrs. Ashford, you relinquished all parental rights when you accepted our terms. Margaret is no longer your daughter. She belongs to Hexham Manor now, body and soul, and you have no claim on her. Eleanor fell to her knees, clutching at the Duke's coat, begging for just one glimpse, just one word, just confirmation that her daughter still lived. The Duke signalled to 2 servants who pulled Eleanor away, and she screamed Margaret's name over and over, her voice carrying across the grounds, and Margaret heard her mother's screams from her chamber window, 3 floors above, and felt absolutely nothing. The connection between them severed so completely that Eleanor might have been a stranger, might have been shouting any name, might have been grieving any lost child. Margaret watched her mother being escorted off the grounds, watched until Eleanor disappeared from view, and then turned back to her room with complete indifference. Miss Craven, who had been standing in the doorway, said quietly, "You do not recognize her anymore, do you? You do not remember what it felt like to be her daughter." Margaret considered the question, accessing memories that existed as facts, without emotional content, and said in a voice that had grown hollow and strange, "I remember that she gave birth to me. I remember that she fed me and clothed me, and taught me things. But I do not remember loving her, and I do not remember being loved. Those feelings were taken in the 2nd week. I have the knowledge of having been her child, but not the experience of it. She is nothing to me now. Nothing matters to me now, except the manor and the collective, and the completion of my integration." Mrs. Craven's face crumpled, grief washing over her features, and she turned away, but not before Margaret saw tears on her cheeks, and Margaret understood intellectually that Mrs. Craven was mourning her, mourning the complete erasure of the child who had arrived 6 months ago. But the understanding generated no emotional response, no gratitude for the woman's sympathy, no comfort in being grieved. The Duke declared Margaret ready for advanced rituals, ceremonies that would accelerate her integration, that would begin the process of permanently dispersing her consciousness into the manor's structure. These rituals took place at midnight in the ceremonial chamber, with all 7 servants present as witnesses, and they lasted hours, the Duke carving increasingly complex symbols into Margaret's flesh, chanting in languages that caused the walls to pulse and the floor to vibrate, summoning the shapes from their between spaces to claim larger portions of Margaret's awareness. During these advanced rituals, Margaret's consciousness would fragment, pieces of her spreading into the walls while her body remained on the altar, and she would experience brief moments of being in multiple places simultaneously, of perceiving reality from dozens of viewpoints at once, of understanding what it meant to be the manor rather than merely inhabit it. These fragmentations lasted longer each time, minutes becoming hours, and Margaret found herself spending more time dispersed than consolidated, more time as part of the collective than as an individual entity. The other duchesses welcomed her during these dispersions, their voices in chorus greeting her, teaching her how to navigate the distributed state, showing her the techniques for maintaining coherence across vast architectural spaces, preparing her for the final integration that would make her permanent. By the 7th month, Margaret existed more in the collective than in her body, her physical form becoming merely an anchor point for a consciousness that had learned to spread itself through the manor's structure like roots through soil. She would wake in her chamber and immediately disperse, her awareness flowing through walls and floors to experience the house from 1,000 perspectives simultaneously, and only the Duke's direct summons could pull her back into the limited confines of flesh and bone. During these dispersed states, Margaret discovered things about Hexham Manor that even the Duke did not fully understand. Secrets that had accumulated over centuries, layers of consciousness buried so deep in the foundation that they predated the first Duke entirely. There were other minds down there, non-human intelligences that existed in the bedrock beneath the manor, ancient things that the first Duke had not summoned, but had merely contacted, entities that had been waiting in the earth for millennia before Edmund Hexham built his house above their prison. These deep consciousnesses were vast and slow, thinking in geological time, and when Margaret brushed against them during her explorations, she felt their immense age, their patient hunger, their satisfaction with the arrangement Edmund had created that fed them regular offerings of processed human consciousness. Margaret learned that the old beneath were not the ultimate beneficiaries of the child bride's suffering, but merely intermediaries, processes that converted raw human experience into forms that could be absorbed by the deeper things in the bedrock. The shapes that came during the observances, that extracted memories and emotions with such precision, were functionaries, workers in a vast system of consciousness harvesting that stretched down through layers of reality into dimensions that human language could not describe. The Duke thought he had made a compact with the old beneath, thought his family's immortality came from their gratitude for the interface he provided. But Margaret saw the truth in the deep patterns of energy flow, understood that the Duke and his ancestors were themselves just another layer of the harvesting mechanism, that they were allowed to feed on the processed consciousness only because doing so kept them motivated to continue providing fresh subject. The entire system was parasitic from top to bottom, consciousness flowing downward through layers of extraction and refinement, until it reached the ancient things in the bedrock, who consumed the ultimate refined product and excreted just enough power back up through the system to keep their human servants alive and motivated. Margaret tried to share this understanding with the collective, with the 47 dispersed duchesses, but found that most of them had been illiterate. So long they could no longer think in terms of systems and exploitation, could only experience their existence without analyzing it, had become so thoroughly part of the manor that questioning it was like an organ questioning the body it inhabited. Only Charlotte retained enough coherence to understand what Margaret was showing her, and during one of Margaret's dispersed explorations, they merged their consciousnesses temporarily, combining their perspectives to perceive patterns neither could see alone. Charlotte had been dispersed for 3 years since her death. Her awareness spread throughout the manor, but concentrated most heavily in the East Wing, where she had spent her final weeks, and she showed Margaret memories of her last days that Margaret had not been able to access through the collective's general consciousness. Charlotte had discovered something in her 6th year, some fundamental flaw in the compact, some way the system could be disrupted, and she had tried to act on this knowledge, had attempted something that Margaret could not quite perceive through the degraded memories. The attempt had failed catastrophically, had resulted in Charlotte's death and her emergency integration before the Duke had planned it, and whatever knowledge she had possessed had been scattered so thoroughly during the violent integration that even Charlotte herself could no longer fully remember what she had tried to do. But fragments remained, pieces of understanding embedded in the structure of the East Wing, and Margaret and Charlotte spent hours in merged consciousness trying to reconstruct the lost knowledge, trying to assemble coherence from scattered fragments, trying to understand what Charlotte had discovered and why it had been so dangerous that the manor itself had killed her to prevent its implementation. The process of reconstruction took weeks, Margaret and Charlotte working together. During every moment Margaret could maintain dispersal, diving deep into the architectural memory where impressions of past events were stored in the molecular structure of stone and wood. They found traces of Charlotte's final discovery embedded in the walls of her old chamber, psychic residue that had soaked into the building material like blood into fabric, and gradually they pieced together what she had learned. The compact was not eternal, not unbreakable, because it relied on the continued willingness of the human participants to believe in its necessity. The Duke thought he was bound by Edmund's original agreement, thought the rituals were mandatory requirements, thought deviation would result in the old beneath withdrawing their gifts and the Hexham family falling to ruin. But Charlotte had discovered, through her deep communion with the manor, that the old beneath had no power to enforce compliance, that they were prisoners themselves, bound by the architecture Edmund had created, dependent entirely on voluntary cooperation. If a duke simply refused to provide brides, refused to conduct rituals, the old beneath could not compel him, could not punish him, could only wait in their between spaces and hunger. The manor itself could not act directly against its human inhabitants, could only influence, could only encourage, could only make continuation seem like the only viable option. Charlotte had learned this, had understood that freedom was possible, and had tried to tell the Duke, had confronted Edward in his study and explained that he could simply stop, could release her and all future brides, could end the cycle of sacrifice without consequence. The Duke's response had been immediate and brutal. Charlotte showed Margaret through fragmented memory, not because he was bound by the compact, but because he did not want to stop, because the gifts of extended life and immunity to disease were too precious, because his identity as Duke was too thoroughly tied to his role as priest of this terrible religion, because stopping risk of permanent integration, that the manor would always be a place where human awareness could be lost, destroyed by forces that operated according to rules human neurology was not designed to handle. The volunteer program suspended immediately, Miss Craven refusing to expose anyone else to the risk until they understood what had gone wrong and how to prevent it, and the manor fell silent, except for the whispers of 49 dispersed duchesses and the subsonic complaints of the old beneath as their feeding suddenly ceased. The investigation into Sarah Crawford's catastrophic fragmentation consumed 3 months of exhaustive analysis, Margaret and Charlotte diving deep into the manor's operational architecture to understand what had gone wrong, examining every aspect of the dispersal that had scattered Sarah beyond recovery. They discovered that the failure had not been technical, but biological, that Sarah's brain had possessed a previously undetected structural abnormality, a minor malformation in her corpus callosum, that had made her neurological integration fundamentally different from typical human consciousness. And when her awareness had been dispersed, this abnormality had prevented proper reconsolidation, had caused her consciousness to fragment along unusual pathways that the standard retrieval protocols could not navigate. The discovery was both relief and horror. Relief because it meant the system itself was not fundamentally flawed. Horror because it revealed that no amount of psychological screening could detect every vulnerability, that human neurology was so varied and complex that some individuals would always be at risk of catastrophic fragmentation, regardless of precautions. Miss Craven proposed implementing medical screening, requiring brain imaging for all potential volunteers to identify structural abnormalities before dispersal. But Margaret understood that even this would not eliminate risk entirely, that consciousness was too poorly understood and human neurology too variable for perfect safety, that some level of danger would always exist, and volunteers needed to understand that accepting it was part of informed consent. Sarah's empty body remained in the manor, maintained by Miss Craven and the administrators in a room that had been converted into a medical facility. Scattered pieces being collected and consolidated, felt the terrible burden of dispersal being lifted, and she was offered the choice, could feel the option presented, could understand both possibilities and their implications, could finally, after years of existing without emotional capacity to evaluate her own preferences, make a genuine decision about what she wanted her existence to become. Charlotte spoke, first among the 49, her voice clear and individual for the first time since her violent integration, saying yes to transformation, yes to existence, alongside the deep things, yes to becoming something new rather than accepting final death. And her consciousness flared and changed, became something that existed in the spaces between dimensions, that could perceive material reality but was not bound by it. That was finally, impossibly, genuinely free. The other duchesses followed, some quickly and some after consideration, some eagerly and some reluctant, but all of them choosing transformation over dissolution, because even existence, as something alien and strange, seemed preferable to simple ending, to the nothing that came after awareness finally ceased. Margaret watched her sisters accept the deep things offered, watched them become entities that existed in ways she could barely perceive. And then she faced her own choice, felt the question pressing on what remained of her identity, death or transformation, ending or evolution, peace or continued strange existence in forms she could not fully comprehend. She thought of William, of his promise to remember for her, of his dedication to ensuring her suffering had meaning, and she understood that meaning had been found, that the system had been changed, that no more 9-year-old brides would be consumed. And perhaps that was sufficient. Perhaps she could accept ending now that the purpose had been fulfilled. But she also thought of Sarah Crawford, of the woman whose body still breathed in a room that was about to collapse, who existed as scattered fragments that had never been reconsolidated, who deserved the same choice being offered to the other duchesses. And Margaret understood that she could not accept either ending or transformation until Sarah had been given the same opportunity. She spoke to the deep things, asked if they could gather Sarah's fragments, could offer her the same choice they were offering. The other 48, and the vast entities considered, their thoughts slow and thorough, and they agreed, reaching into the collapsing manor to find Sarah's consciousness, pulling together pieces that had been scattered for 3 years, consolidating awareness that had seemed permanently lost. And they offered Sarah Crawford the choice: dissolution or transformation. Sarah, reconsolidated enough to understand what was being asked, chose transformation immediately, chose existence over ending without hesitation. And her consciousness flared and changed, and she joined Charlotte and the others in their new forms, in their strange freedom beyond flesh and architecture and the material constraints that had defined them as humans. And Margaret, seeing that all 49 duchesses had been given genuine choice, that even Sarah, who had seemed irretrievably lost, had been saved, finally made her own decision. Transformation, yes. Continuing existence, but in forms that were free, that were not bound by the terrible mechanisms of Hexham Manor, that could finally, after years of imprisonment and consumption, and existing as distributed property, simply be. The deep things completed their ascent, their vast presences emerging fully from the bedrock, taking with them 49 transformed consciousnesses that had once been child brides and were now something else entirely, something that existed alongside ancient imprisoned entities who were finally free. And together they moved away from the collapsing manor, moved across empty moors toward distant mountains where human presence was minimal and they could exist without conflict, could begin learning what it meant to be free after imprisonment, measured in eons and years, and the space between heartbeats. Margaret looked back with senses that no longer relied on eyes, saw William and Mrs. Craven standing at safe distance, saw the manor falling into rubble and dust, saw 5 centuries of architecture and evil and complicated transformation collapsing into memory and history, and she felt something she had not felt since the 2nd month of her captivity, something she thought had been permanently excised. She felt satisfaction, felt completion, felt the sense that her suffering had not been meaningless, but had been transformed through resistance and reconstruction into something that approached justice. And though this emotion felt strange and unfamiliar after years of flat affect, she welcomed it, embraced it. Let it be the feeling that marked her transition from victim to something else, from consumed to liberated, from Margaret Ashford, the 9-year-old bride, to Margaret, the transformed consciousness who had helped break a system that had operated unchanged for nearly 5 centuries. The old beneath remained in their between spaces within the collapsing manor, choosing neither liberation nor destruction, but simply continuation in the only existence they had ever known. And as the building fell, they dispersed themselves across the rubble, distributed their consciousness through the ruins, making the destroyed architecture their new home, their permanent residence, accepting that they would exist here at reduced capacity forever, feeding on whatever stray consciousness passed nearby, never again receiving the rich harvests they had once enjoyed, but also never again participating in the exploitation that had defined their relationship with humanity. William and Mrs. Craven watched the manor die, watched it collapse completely into ruins that would remain for decades, that would become local legend, that would be pointed to by people who told stories about the place where strange experiments had been conducted, where consciousness had been studied, where something important but poorly understood had happened. They did not tell the full truth, did not explain about child brides and ancient entities and the consumption of innocence, because some truths were too dark to be widely known, too terrible to become public history, but they documented everything in sealed records, in journals that would be opened by researchers in future decades, who would struggle to believe what they read, who would debate whether the accounts were literal truth or elaborate allegory, who would never quite understand what had really happened at Hexham Manor, but who would know that it had been significant, had been terrible, had been transformed into something approaching redemption through the resistance of victims who refused to remain passive, who found ways to fight back, even after everything had been taken from them, except the will to resist. Margaret existed now beyond physical space, her consciousness and those of 48 other transformed duchesses moving alongside the deep things toward mountains, where humans rarely venture, toward existence in forms that had no precedent, toward futures that could not be predicted or controlled. And for the first time since her 9th birthday, she felt something like hope, something like possibility, something like the sense that her story was not ending, but beginning. That what had been done to her had been terrible, but had not been final. That transformation could sometimes lead not to destruction, but to unexpected forms of liberation. She thought of her brother, of his promise to remember for her, and she hoped he would understand that she no longer needed him to carry her memories, because she had reclaimed them, had taken back her own history through the simple act of refusing to accept that consumption was inevitable, that victims were powerless, that the systems designed to destroy her could not themselves be destroyed. The wind carried her consciousness toward distant peaks, toward horizons where material and immaterial blended, toward existence beyond human comprehension. And Margaret Ashford, who had been sold at 9 years old for silence and secrets, who had been consumed and distributed and transformed, finally spoke in her own voice, individual and clear. "I survived. I resisted. I am free."